Shay, have you ever asked a question in class and the students look at you like you have two heads, like they have no idea what you just said?
You're describing the story of my life. Of course, actually, I recently entered a breakout room on Zoom, and one student was saying she had no idea what the heck I was asking.
Yeah.
Ugh,
Sometimes I have a question in my head, but then it just doesn't come across as clearly as I want when I actually pose it to the students.
mhm. Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
And I think in those moments, you just have to own it. Pause what you're doing, admit your question was unclear,
Mhm.
and clarify your question for your students.
I agree, but also beyond reformulating, I think we need to practice asking clear questions from the start, asking questions with intention and foresight.
Absolutely. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shay.
And I'm Anna. So, Shay, questions.
Questions. They're such a central part of teaching, but they don't always have the effect we want.
Yes, when American philosopher Thomas Kuhn said, "The answers you get depend on the questions you ask," he was definitely onto
Oh,
something.
for sure. So, how do we ask questions to get the answers we're looking for? We asked our audience to contribute examples of times when a question they asked was particularly successful. What did we get, Anna?
So, Vilena told us about a discussion she had on techniques for successful communication. During that discussion, she asked, "Do you think you're a good conversationalist?" Her student had a lot to say on the topic. They delved into what it means to be a good speaker versus listener, as well as ways to improve your conversation style. She says the discussion lasted for 30 minutes, even though she'd initially allocated only 5 minutes.
Wow. So it sounds like one question launched into an entire discussion. I love that Vilena embraced that teachable moment. And she really hit the nail on the head there. The topic was relatable since we all have experience with
Yeah.
conversations. So the student had something to say. And she also asked a question that was thought provoking and didn't lend itself to an obvious response. I could see how a question like that would breed even more questions to explore.
For sure.
Mm.
And often that's just what we want to launch a great discussion. But I think we have to recognize that in a classroom setting, questions play many different roles.
Definitely. First, I think we need to consider context. At what point of the lesson are you? What have
Mhm.
you discussed previously? What background knowledge do we have? What's the level of the students?
Yeah, from that, you can determine what kind of question to ask.
Right. So in Velena's case, I'm guessing they had already established to some extent the topic of the lesson.
Hmm.
For that reason, she was able to ask this yes or no question. Are you a good conversationalist? With the knowledge that it wouldn't be answered with a simple yes or no,
Hmm.
and knowing that then she could dig deeper with more questions.
And I mean, I assume the student was at an intermediate or advanced level, right? That's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yes, we need to consider the context of the individual lesson and the student's levels and needs.
Yeah.
And from there, we can ask, how can we ensure that we're asking meaningful questions that are engaging all of our learners at their respective levels?
That's the tricky part. What comes to mind here is Bloom's taxonomy.
Bloom's. Yes, I think that many of our listeners may be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but let's recap it, shall we, Anna?
Yes. So, Bloom created a classification system to distinguish between different levels of human cognition, emphasizing higher order thinking necessary for the 21st century. It's basically a scale from simplest task to most complex task.
And the first level is remember, right? The simplest thing we can do is recall information. The
Mhm.
highest level is create, making up what, 6 levels total?
Yeah, well, there's a few versions of Bloom's taxonomy out there, but generally there are six from easiest to hardest: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create.
Right, that's it. It starts with lower order thinking skills and ends with higher order skills.
Yes, and this applies to questions.
Mm.
You can categorize your questions based on each level in the taxonomy. Bloom encourages teachers to consider two things up front: the capabilities of the learners and the purpose of their question.
Yes. First, who are your learners and what are they capable of? And then, what are you trying to achieve with them? What type of response are you looking for? What level of critical thought or critical production are you aiming for?
Great considerations. And what we should point out here is that Bloom's lower level questions could serve as scaffolding or support systems to get students to answer higher level questions.
Let's take an example. I really like to pull in pictures of current events to generate conversation. Students examine the image for a few minutes on their own, taking some time to process the image. Then I'll ask them questions that require different levels of thought. Of course, I'll start with the more superficial elements. Describe what you see, what is happening in this picture.
Good.
And then from there, I'm able to build upon that more basic level of cognition, asking students to infer information from the image. How did this come to be? What are some of the factors that contribute to this occurrence? With this foundation, you can then launch into opinion questions, right?
Yeah, this reminds me actually of an observation I did recently of a novice teacher. The teacher had shown a video of people at a parade celebrating, I don't know, some kind of national holiday. Maybe it was Independence Day. At the end of the video, the teacher asked the students, how do the people in the video feel? And the question was met with total silence. These were beginner or low intermediate students, so it was just too hard for them off the bat.
Yikes.
So, to help them answer this larger question, the teacher went back and asked, what are the people doing? Are they smiling or frowning? What are they holding? I think they were waving flags or something. So, after answering these more descriptive questions, the students were able to answer the question about how the people feel. They feel happy, proud, patriotic, and whatnot.
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic example of how you can essentially use lower level questions to get students to achieve a higher level of thinking. Nice.
Yeah. So you can see how Bloom's taxonomy would be really helpful to refer to when planning your questions. I personally refer to it a few times in the semester when I need some support figuring out how to level my questions and meet learning objectives.
It's always good to come back to the basics. And Bloom's is a great tool in determining what type of question to ask.
Yeah. So, types of questions. The way you ask a question makes a world of difference in the response you get. The classic example that comes to mind for me is the difference between do you have any questions versus what are your questions?
Good one.
I remember when I was a graduate student, my classroom practices lecturer warned us against, do you have any questions? And I've remembered that ever since. She explained that a question like that would most likely be met with silence.
Yes, I was taught that too. With a question like, do you have any questions? You're implying that there aren't, or at least there shouldn't be any questions. It's kind of a leading question in itself.
Right. Leading questions lead the respondent towards a certain response.
A few examples of leading questions could be, do you have any issues with the project? Or did you enjoy working on that project? The former subtly prompts the respondent towards a negative response, and the latter towards a positive. So when you're put on the spot, we usually opt for whatever the question is insinuating, right? And especially when we're in a scenario where there is a perceived hierarchy or power dynamic.
Like in a class with a big, scary teacher. So in general, I'd say asking a more open-ended question like, how did you get on with that project will get you a more balanced answer.
What I like about open questions is that they don't have a right answer. We're interested in the discussion that's generated by the question and the opinions of the students involved.
Yes, that's an important consideration. When determining the purpose of our questions, do we intend to receive a succinct response, or are we looking for a broader exploration of the question?
Right. Closed or polar questions generally invite a one-word answer, such as yes or no. An example might be, do you drive? Or did you take my pen? Since my students are forever taking my pens. They could also include answers to factual or multiple choice questions, such as, what's your name? Or would you like tea, coffee, or water?
Tea, please. But right, for these, we might only get a one-word answer. And it's not going to help with language development if we're always looking for just one single right answer. We want students to use language creatively. But that doesn't mean there isn't a place for these questions in a class, of course. Sometimes we do want a succinct response. If you're in a content class, you might actually want students to show their knowledge or understanding. Like in a science class, you might ask, why do lizards sit out in the sun?
And sometimes you have the weirdest examples.
Yeah, that's just how my brain works. But do you know why, Shay?
I'll admit I do not.
It's because lizards and other reptiles are cold-blooded, so they have to sit out in the sun to get warm. No joke, it's science.
Nice. So this is a good example of a closed question that has a right answer. It's factual. It's not going beyond the correct answer. And it's valid, but it's not going to generate much more discussion than that, unless you follow up with more questions.
Yeah, so coming back to Vilena's question, it was a polar question, right? Are you a good conversationalist? But she might have asked as a follow-up, why? Why not? Polar questions and leading questions can be used as scaffolding for more open questions. Once you know what someone thinks, you can get more out of them. For example, if I ask, would you take an at-home DNA test? And the student responds, yes, then I could say, why? The student might say, I want to know if I'm prone to any diseases.
And in order to respond to that why question, students are using their own experience and personal opinions.
Precisely. And it's also a specific question because by that point, you've clearly determined the focus and they've had time to think about their answer, at least a little, by answering yes or no. So by the time you get to that open-ended question, they might be more prepared to answer.
And then you're less likely to be met with blank stares, right? This is sort of like previewing, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say so.
So in addition to using yes or no questions to prepare students for a more open question, we can also explicitly preview questions before an activity. Like before watching a short video or doing a reading, you give them the questions that you'll later discuss so that they're more prepared to understand the content itself and also have a chance to mull the questions over while watching or reading.
The last thing we wanted to mention before we bid our listeners farewell is to consider the specificity of the question. A question that's more specific, at least in my experience, tends to be more effective. Whenever I ask a generic question like, what do you think? Just point blank, no lead up discussion. It doesn't really get the discussion very far, does it?
Blank stares again.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. You read something, maybe you're reading a speech by someone famous, and then you ask students, what do you think? They're just going to look at you like, what do you want us to say?
Yeah, I don't know how I'd answer that question.
Me neither. A question like, which parts of this speech bring up the most emotion for you is much more specific. It's still leaving it open-ended. They could have any sort of emotion, anger, sadness, rebelliousness, annoyance, but you're still giving them something specific to go on. Identify a place where you felt something. And especially if you previewed that question, they would be much more aware of their feelings throughout the process and might end up yielding a great discussion about rhetorical strategies and how they contribute to the impact of a speech.
Nice example. You can see how just a little planning and foresight could lead you to such an interesting and specific question. I can just picture what kinds of responses the students might have. So I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. When planning the questions we want to ask in a lesson, we should consider the context, what we know about our students, and also picture what kind of answers our question might bring about.
It always comes down to planning.
Yes, planning and experience.
So let's give our listeners a chance to reflect on their experiences before we go.
Yes, speaking of questions, here's some food for thought for our listeners.
Yum, yum.
To what extent do you plan your questions before a class? What kinds of questions do you rely on?
And how do you use different levels of questions in your class?
We welcome you to reflect on these questions and join the conversation on our various social media accounts. You can email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or contact us via Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
For more resources and references on today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast's Anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud.
Thanks for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.